Hey, badass black girls, and they making big moves. Hey, badass black girls, nothing that you can't do. They are the future, I'm trying to tell ya. They want the best, no time to settle. They got the strength to handle the pressure. These are the queens, nobody better. Yeah, changing the narrative, that is imperative. They about to rock this. Tell the women that you got this. Got no time for people who are toxic. It's all love, good vibes. You know I got your back, girl. Talking issues that matter. This is badass black girl, yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Badass Black Girl. I'm here with Nehemie. Hi, Nehemie.
Hey.
As you know, we're both part of the Badass Black Girl team. We're so happy to welcome someone new to our community. Aya de Leon is here with us. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here, Aya. Would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Aya de Leon. I'm a novelist, activist. Um, I also have a background in doing poetry, spoken word, and hip hop theater, but I turned to fiction within the past decade or so. And I have a series called Justice Hustlers with Kensington Books of feminist heist novels. And my first standalone spy novel just came out, A Spy in the Struggle. And I'm also working on a young adult spy novel that'll come out in 2022. And in the meantime, I have a hip hop novel called Queen of Urban Prophecy that's due out in August. So a lot of fiction these days.
So I wanted to know, we're in the midst of year two of being in lockdown and all these different things. How has coronavirus and just this time of being indoors and not being on your regular daily schedule, how has that influenced your writing?
Um, I before I say this, I just want to say that like this kind of disruption affects everyone differently, and there's no right way to respond. Just like grief, and we're living in a time of great grief. You know, we have over 500,000 folks whom we've lost in this pandemic. So there's a lot of grieving, there's a lot of disruption, and everybody responds differently. That said, my psychological makeup and my trauma coping mechanisms are when things get really hard, I work compulsively. So for me, this has been an incredibly productive time. And I put that in quotes because, you know, when you're sort of driven by compulsion and anxiety, the things that you achieve and accomplish, you know, come at a slightly different type of cost. But I think, you know, during the pandemic, many of us have sort of leaned into different kind of self-soothing behaviors. For some of us, it's binge watching TV. For me, it's compulsively writing novels. And so, you know, and part of that really has been about how little control, right, I feel in my everyday life as a mom, as a teacher. It just feels, you know, the pandemic, the kinds of, you know, so much of the beginning of the pandemic was spent with this like looming fascism prior to the election and then looming violence after the election. And now we have sort of the aftermath of that violence and the struggle for accountability. So many reasons to be anxious, the climate crisis, you know, the ongoing attacks on women, Black people, and other people of color. So, yeah, there are many reasons to be anxious. And for me, the space of writing is the only space in my life where I have that level of control. I can decide what the story is. I can decide who in the story is in charge. I can decide who lives, who dies, how it turns out. No wonder I would wake up like 5 in the morning and rush to my desk to spend as much time as possible in that space prior to, you know, needing to parent and, you know, get my kid kind of ready for the day. And I'll also say I'm incredibly fortunate to have access to a small pod school. So my kid has been able to do in person school, which has meant that I've had a little bit of breathing space to do, the many other things that I do have to do as a working parent in addition to writing. So that the pandemic has been, um, a space of great productivity for me, but, based in the kind of intense anxiety and stress.
So, talking about the anxiety and the stress and the lack of control, has there been anything that has been kind of giving you little glimpses of joy within this pandemic? What has been keeping you going aside from writing?
Well, one of the things that has been really powerful in the pandemic has been just the way that different friends and community members, we found ourselves reaching for each other. This has really included people who live far away. So, kind of different groups of women writers have been, we've been reaching for each other and creating sort of sister circles to just be able to like talk and share resources and get advice from each other. And that's been really lovely. And also just friends of mine whom I've, been friends with for a decade. I love these women, but I never used to call them. Like we'd text back and forth and try and get together. But now like we call each other just randomly and we're like, what's up? Nothing. I'm just calling. Like we're, it's like, oh yeah, right. We're doing that now. It's like a little bit of adjustment. But I think there's just been it's been so necessary to just connect. And I think that it's been this opportunity to look at our disconnection. I think early in the pandemic, it was just an opportunity for me to look at my disconnection because once I figured out, how to get my kid to a school place, like my life didn't look that different than it had before because, I spent so much time as a writer and a teacher kind of at my desk, right? So it was like, oh, wow, this is showing me that I need more connection in my daily life. And so I get to look at pursuing that once we come out of lockdown.
Um, I had a question for you, Aya, about the body of your work. So you've written a series, and it just got me thinking about what led you to become a writer, and also because we've been talking about the pandemic, and one activity that I know I've been really into during the pandemic is reading. I wanted to know a little bit about your favorite writers and your journey to becoming who you are today.
God, what a great question. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. I feel like one thing, I have a lot of friends who are different kinds of artists, and the dancers and the theater artists are so, are really struggling in a way that the writers, were struggling differently, but just the basics of the day to day practice of our art is not nearly as disrupted as folks who have kind of in-person practices like dance and theater and spoken word and the singers and the musicians. Like that's so hard. Um, so I felt really grateful and fortunate to be able to continue. And like right now, I'm teaching. For the first time, I'm teaching graduate creative writing. And so I'm reading and rereading a number of different books. One of my favorite books that I got to teach this semester is My Sister, the Serial Killer, which is this really wonderful Nigerian novel. And it was a joy to teach. Also really loving, right now I'm rereading Caucasia by Dan Senna, which has just always been one of my favorite books. And I haven't reread it until now, and it's even better. It's so good. But my process of becoming a writer in my early 20s, I had these fiction ideas, and they were never short stories. I was like, yeah, I'll write a short story, and it was always like, no, there's more, write more, and so then I would try and write more, and eventually they sort of stretched out and it became clear that they were novels. But I did not have the attention span in my 20s to write a novel. I just didn't. I'm very extroverted and I couldn't sort of sit by myself in a room for that amount of time. And so eventually I got involved in sort of the spoken word and slam poetry and hip hop theater, which was performative. And hip hop theater in particular was really helpful because it allowed me to write a longer story and learn kind of the development of a longer story, but it was performed, right? And so I detoured into that for about a decade and then came back around to the fiction. And, I always wanted to write stories that centered women of color, women of African heritage, and genre fiction always really attracted me. I grew up reading a lot of genre fiction. So, like, for example, My Sister the Serial Killer it's a literary novel, but it also is kind of a thriller. And I'm teaching Caucasia because it's also a literary novel that's plotted a lot like a thriller. So I love that kind of like fast paced, intense twists and turns. I love that in a book. And so I found myself really writing thrillers, writing genre fiction. I really want to write for the masses of women, for the masses of women of color. And I want to write books that really have a broad appeal, particularly to women and women of color from different class backgrounds, right? So I want the work to be really accessible, but I also want it to be rich and complex. So for some folks who are just looking for like that, juicy plot and that drama, that there's something there. But for folks who, want like, layers and layers of different kinds of political and cultural meaning, you can have that plus, drama and plot, So it's like, I feel like I really want books that can conceivably put communities in conversation across difference, and particularly women. I mean, white women need them too. It's not excluding anyone, but it's definitely about putting women of color in the center and putting and having plots that are really about women of color fighting disempowerment, fighting legacies of racism, colonization, and misogyny, fighting exploitation, and teaming up and winning.
I love that. I was actually going to ask, like, is there like a running theme that you have in your books? And you just told me, which is, I'm really excited about your book, Aspiring the Struggle. I wanted to know more about like your writing process, and like, did you wake up at like 2 o'clock in the morning? Were you up at night? Like, what was the process like? And like, what were your feelings with writing this book?
Well, I want to back up and say with the running themes, definitely like, the themes are about resistance and movements, and communities. And the other big running theme, because a lot of these are romances, like they're thrillers, they got a lot going on, they're super political, but they're also romances with a very traditional romantic arc. And that is to say, boy and girl meet, then there's a problem, with a happily ever after. Like they're all very predictably along that arc, right? And for that, because romance is complicated, right? It is not always a feminist form. And so for me, it's been really important in the name of Black love to reclaim that, right? And so for me, one of the themes is really about patriarchy. The romances are ultimately always about resisting patriarchy. And so the obstacle in the romance is always some way that the guy has to choose between allegiance to the patriarchy and his male privilege, or he has to choose his partner, and that's the choice. That's the battle. And that never gets old to me. Because I feel like that's so much of what we're up against out here in these streets, right? Whether it's heterosexual women trying to partner with men, or, queer women who also date men, or just women trying to live our lives out here, where there's a constant set of challenges where we interact with men, whether it's on the street, at work, in our families, where we're trying to say, hey, please pick me and my liberation over your allegiance to the patriarchy. And so that's one of the themes that definitely carries through all these books. And then A Spy in the Struggle is very different from a lot of these other books. So the first book of the I have, like I said, a feminist heist series called Justice Hustlers. And the first Justice Hustlers book took me about 8 years to write. But I was learning a lot about how to structure a novel, and then I was fighting to try and get an agent and then to sell it. That was about an 8 year process. And with that, we developed the template, right? So this is the template for this series. And then it was the structure. And the structure really has three things. It has a heist plot, a romance plot, and then some family drama. And once I had established that, I could write those books pretty quickly. And so there are four of them. A Spy in the Struggle was really different because I started A Spy in the Struggle early in my 20s, before I had my spoken word life. And I was doing community organizing with this Black organization that was pretty radical. And we studied the legacy of the Black Panthers, and we studied the FBI infiltration of the Black Panthers via COINTELPRO. And the conclusion that we came to from looking at that, the FBI really went after the Panthers to destroy the movement, and they used all kinds of different dirty tricks, including just straight up assassinating people. But one of the more subtle things that they did was they would send letters from, allegedly from one leader to another, and, just say ridiculous stuff. And because at that time in the movement, a lot of people didn't have good communication skills, they would just be like, what? And they wouldn't like go to the person and say, what's with this letter you sent? The other person would be like, what letter? It's the FBI, right? But that didn't happen because people didn't have those relationship and communication skills. So the idea was that if we ever were to get infiltrated, that the most important thing that we could do was not like be looking for the infiltrator, it's you, but actually that we would have good relationships, really healthy relationships and good communication, and that would be our best protection against being taken down from within by that kind of infiltration. And so there was something about that that really captivated me in terms of what would happen if people did have good relationships and were a healthy community and an infiltrator came in. And the way that I understand it now in terms of sort of contemporary Black movement thinking is this: what would happen if there was an unapologetically Black organization fighting for Black people's freedom? And what if the FBI sent somebody who was apologetically Black, right? Somebody who had a lot of internalized racism that they hadn't explored, but then they had to pretend in this environment to be open to this unapologetic Blackness. And I, think that would actually be very compelling, because I believe that deep inside, people want to be free and people want to be connected. So, this novel is really an exploration about this woman who, she has her childhood trauma, and she's come to the conclusion that, structural racism isn't really a thing. And if Black people have problems, it's because they haven't worked hard enough or they've made bad choices. And she's going to work hard and she's going to get the American dream. And so, and of course, she's a millennial. The American dream is much harder than she thought, but she's committed to getting it. And then, she goes and gets sent to infiltrate this organization that is like unapologetically Black, has a lot of, it's a youth leadership organization. So there's these teenagers, and like it just shakes her world up in a whole lot of ways. So the FBI expects that they're going to send her to disrupt the organization, but really the organization ends up disrupting her.
This is fascinating. And I have to say that your writing is really gripping, and just listening to you, you're such a great speaker as well. It's like I want to know
Oh, thank
everything
you.
about you and what you do. My next question has to do with one thing you mentioned a little while before this question. You talked a little bit about community, and my thoughts, of course, went to so many places. I thought about community of women, the Black community, the community of writers. One of the things that we're trying to do with Badass Black Girl, for instance, is have a place where Black women can gather and have conversations just like the one we're having today. And one question that I get a lot from younger writers, Black and female, is where do we connect with other Black female writers? Is there a place where we go and we connect? So, what is your experience with that? How do you maintain that community, that writing community constituted of Black female writers?
That's a really good question. And I don't know that I have the answer to it. I think there's a larger community of Black women writers, that I have a lot of connections in. And at different times, I don't know if you guys can hear, in the pandemic, we have a little bit of a farm. So I have a chicken in the background making a lot of noise. So, at times I've been in writers groups with just Black women, and that's been wonderful. At other times, I've had like intense, really intimate writing partnerships with like one other sister, and that was really powerful. I've been able to make connections with Black women at a lot of different kind of larger gatherings. I think it's really, really important to have, just like I was talking about in terms of a spy in the struggle, I think it's really important to have strong relationships with other Black women writers, because, the literary industry is really struggling around racism, sexism, and classism, and homophobia and ableism, and, a lot of other isms, xenophobia. And so I think it is really critical to have those relationships. I think in this moment, I cannot think institutionally of like a space that exists already that's specifically just for Black women that I've engaged with, that I can say, yes, like I went to that and it was the business. But I also think, a lot, I think there's some ways that I'm not the best expert on that, because I think that those kinds of spaces are so critical when people are really emerging as authors. And, for me now that I have an agent, that I have an editor, I have a team. And this is the thing that I will say that I think is really critical. Just has to do with capitalism, right? So once I got an agent and got a book deal, then my career was happening in capitalism. And then capitalism is going to make some money off of it. So it's going to give me a team to help me make it happen, because they're going to make some money off of it. But prior to having my career sort of landed in capitalism, that's the time when you're really like, okay, who's going to be my team? Because capitalism is not on your team yet. And I'm not sure that capitalism is ever really on your team, but at least, there's no investment. And so I think that is the time, really as an emerging artist, as a young artist, as someone just starting out, trying to figure out what your team is. The thing I will also say that's very, very important. The thing that I will say that's critical is sometimes people go and get an MFA, right? If that's one route that people take. It's expensive. It's not for everybody. Not everyone wants to go the graduate school route. But I will say that it is really important to do your homework on any program that you want to go to as a Black woman, because, there are a lot of really shady things that happen in these communities for us. One thing that, there's a new sort of round of this coming out. One thing that happens is predatory behavior by some of the male leadership in different writing communities. And it is, really unfortunate that our communities are in such bad shape around this kind of trauma that we can't show up and protect women in general and protect Black women in particular. But that is the shape that we're in. And so I offer engaging in any of these, you know, kind of co-ed communities, you know, just with that caveat, like really, we got to be careful and we got to, you know, inform each other, and we got to fight for accountability in those communities, especially for young women artists. So I do encourage, just around that alone, it's really helpful to engage in communities that are run by women. Because the other thing is, like, even when there's not predatory behavior, there's like, you know, all this other like preferential and, you know, sexual harassment, you know, just like those things are very real. So do your homework, look around, you know, find out what the word is on the street, make sure, and if you know, if you're going to go anywhere, make sure you actually know someone who has gone, right? That you actually can talk to someone, so you're not just going with, like, you know, anything can, as we know, anything can look good on the internet. So I would say that. And I would say, you know, the thing, and then there are women's environments, right? And if they're run by white women, then, you know, there's racism, and there's a lot of stuff to be dealt with around racism for women of color, and Black women in particular. And one of the things that happens that's really, really hard for us as writers is getting clear feedback around our work that isn't tinged with the racism and the sexism, right? So part of what happens is we write something, and if we share it in a largely white MFA classroom, right, we get like, well, I don't understand, like, well, I don't get it, right? You know, or you deal with like people not understanding it because people are steeped in whiteness and don't understand your context. They don't understand what you're writing into. So that's one thing. Or, you know, we want to tell the truth about our communities, and there are really hard things going on. And like, you know, kind of middle-class white people feel very uncomfortable with us being real about the impact of racism, sexism, colonization, et cetera, on our communities. So we really have to be thoughtful about where we're gonna share our work. At the same time, you know, a lot of times in those environments, people give us feedback about what's wrong with the work, and you can't tell like what's true, right? Because it's going through this lens of like racism, sexism, classism, et cetera, and you can't figure out how to make your work better. So, you know, I would just say it's really important to find those communities, and sometimes it's not a big institution. Where I live, in the Bay Area, there's a magazine called Poetry Flash, and they're online, poetryflash.org. And they have, you know, they advertise different writing circles and open mics and stuff. And so it's useful to look around and see. Poets and Writers have stuff sometimes too, but again, that's really national. But figuring out like where to find out, where to go to find out when and where there are classes starting. The Loft in, not exactly sure where it is, but the Loft has online writers classes. So, you know, online sometimes can be better in terms of some of this harassment stuff, but, you know, not always better in terms of getting feedback for your work. You know, a lot of these environments are white. So we've got a lot of work to do in terms of founding and creating spaces that are designed to support and nurture Black women writers. And in the meantime, it's trial and error. And if it really doesn't feel right, it's probably not right. So trust your instinct, girl.
Thank you so much, Aya, for joining us today. It was a blast to have you and talk about what you do, and you provided such great insight on different topics of importance to Black women, and particularly Black women writers. And I can't thank you enough. It's been a pleasure to have you. We hope that you will stop by again to as you publish more books and you have some updates that you want to share. You're always welcome here in this space, and we hope to see you again soon.
Yay, thank you so much. It is a joy to be here in the space of the badass Black girls. That's fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you again soon.
Take care.